I'm so honored to introduce Dr. Sara Valente today. I remember Dr. Valente from the time when she wasn't quite a doctor yet. She was a student in one of my undergraduate classes on the Holocaust, and I thought very early on, I knew this is someone special. And sure enough, she went on to do original and important research as a graduate student. Her dissertation on the memoirs of survivors in Brazil was just broke new ground for the field. I remember sitting in the audience when she gave a presentation at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and many people, many scholars came up to me and said, this young woman is something amazing. And I said, I know. I have the great blessing of working with her. She is a visiting professor at the Ackerman Center. She teaches courses on Jewish and Latin American history, literature, cultural memory. Her fields of expertise include Holocaust studies, translation studies, human rights. She has an article soon to be published, recently published actually, on the post-World War II Brazil called A New Homeland for Jews and Nazis, recently published in the journal Comparative Cultural Studies, European and Latin American Perspectives. Dr. Valente is a super accomplished musician, writer, editor. She's the producer and host for the Ackerman Center podcast. We just released a new episode this past Sunday, so I urge you to tune in. And in any case, we're all in for a unique and insightful presentation by Dr. Sara Valente. Please welcome her.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson, for that kind introduction. I hope to live up to what you have just said. Thank you all for being here with us this afternoon for the last installment of the spring lecture series, which we have had for the past month, focusing on Jewish and national memory of dictatorships in Latin America. I also want to thank Cindy for hosting this event, as well as my colleagues whose exceptional lectures precede my own. And so we had Dr. Amy Kerner speak a few weeks ago about language and trauma, where she talked about Yiddish in the post-dictatorial Argentina. And 2 weeks ago, we had my colleague, Dr. Pedro Gonzalez, speak about memories of social engineering, where he covered a wide spectrum of facts about the state-sponsored violence in Mexico and Argentina. And so today my talk focuses on the ways in which Holocaust memory and dictatorship memory actually intersect in some ways, in a few cases that we can point to in Brazilian literature. And I have this slide here. Let me try to move this slide along. We have the map. Hope everyone can see the map. And when we think about Latin American Jewish literature, oftentimes that memory of the Holocaust is so intertwined in the works of the authors because they themselves come from Jewish families whose experience with the Holocaust was either direct or indirect, in the sense that, as we see in this map, that tracks the Jewish immigration from Germany, specifically from 33 to 40, we can see that an estimated amount of 83,000 people, German Jews, fled to Latin America in those years. And so when we think about the authors in Latin America who are writing about their experiences with the military dictatorships that occurred in Latin America. All right, didn't realize that I have a little, I have to click for the ears to come through. But here we go. If we think about the different literary works that are coming from Jewish writers in Latin America about their personal experiences, the horrors of state-sponsored violence um, under the military regimes that were wide and far-reaching. Here on the slide in front of you, I have just a couple of the places with the dates of when the dictatorships occurred. There are many more, so we could have filled this whole map. But if we get, for example, look at Argentina, we have many cases that we can point to that would give us a great understanding of how this memory of the Holocaust intersects with the work that has to do with the memory of the dictatorship. For example, some of you might be familiar, and these are just two of the most famous cases that we have when discussing this topic of Holocaust and dictatorship memory, which is the Argentine Jacobo Timmerman. You see the cover of his book on the left lower corner of your screen, which is Prisoner Without a Name in Cell Without a Number, which he published in 1980, right at the in the middle of the dictatorship in Argentina. And we also have the wide known case in Uruguay by Mauricio Rosenkopf, The Letters That Never Came, which was published after the end of the dictatorship in Uruguay in 2000. And both authors of great renown in their respective countries. Their works have, reached great literary acclaim in their countries, and they are foundational works for people who are interested in understanding more about how these memories intersect. Now, the case of Holocaust memory and dictatorship in Brazil is not so obvious. It is actually a much slower process. It has been much slower to actually appear. And today I would like to introduce you to two literary works that come to my mind that best exemplify this connection. After a law was enacted in Brazil in 2011 to institute a National Truth Commission, meaning this was a organization, a body, a commission that was created in order for the country to investigate and recover the memory of the cases of missing political prisoners, of arrests, unjust arrests, of tortures, murders, disappearances that had been done by agents of the Brazilian state. After this law was enacted in 2011, instituting this commission, is the moment where we actually start to see a movement happening within the publishing world, in the editorial market, with the launch of many academic works, as well as fiction, nonfiction, that have to do with that history. And so for today, I would like to focus on these two. The one that we see here on the left, the Three Tearless Histories, is a work that actually contains three stories. And I will today be talking about the first one, which is titled The Klagsbrunn Family, A Story Coming to Light, where the author traces this multi-generational story about a Jewish family that immigrates from Vienna to Rio in Brazil, where they emigrate from Vienna to Brazil, escaping, of course, the Nazis. And in Brazil is where the grandson of this family and his wife are tortured and and have to flee for their lives, and they have to go into exile during the dictatorship for their political activities. They, and I will go through this as the presentation goes on to show you, but they actually have to flee to Chile. Right when the Chilean military coup is about to happen, they flee to Argentina right at the moment where Argentina's dictatorship is also about to happen. And then finally they go to Europe. They leave the continent, finding a place in Italy, and then ironically they're welcomed back to in Germany, actually. And so I will talk about this story because that memory, the close relationship, the multi-generational memory of these events, these horrific events that happen in history, become really important, a driving force for the literature and the narrative. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see the other work that I will be discussing today. It is a novel by the title K, simply the letter K, that was published by Bernardo Kucinski in 2011. And it is a fictional story about a father who searches for his daughter who has been disappeared during the military dictatorship in Brazil. The first edition that was published in Brazil sold out in a few weeks. It has been shortlisted for many literary prizes. It has also been received to great acclaim. And in both these texts, we see how the authors address what happens to the second and third generation of descendants of war refugees who relocate to countries that obviously their ancestors had no idea would one day become an incredible political turmoil. And so both books, both novels are driven by the trauma of Brazil's recent history. Both of these works demonstrate that the memory of the Holocaust and the dictatorships are not relegated to some distant past, but rather there is no separation of time and space in the way that it is written in these literary works. And in fact, the stories, the characters, they signal to a kind of systematic continuation of violence and the trauma of this violence and the memory of the trauma of this violence that continues on even to present time. And Professor Patterson in his kind introduction mentioned about my dissertation with the memoirs of Holocaust survivors. And what is interesting is that, you know, in the works of survivors, when they finally publish their works, there is a lot of this fear that is, you know, you can read between the lines in their works. In these fictional novels that I will be talking about today, this is very explicit. It is a part of the driving force of the narrative. And so the first one that I would like for us to talk about, I do have to clarify that the author himself that writes this text, the three tearless stories, he is actually Austrian, but he wrote this story with the participation and collaboration of Victor, who is the Brazilian protagonist in the book. So this is a nonfiction work that resembles a lot of other Latin American testimonial literature. That's, you know, the genre that it falls under, where the authors utilize documentary history in order to confront the readers with a darker side of history. And so this work of nonfiction first appeared in 2014, so it's quite recent. It was translated into English in 2017. And it tells the three stories. All of them involve photography. And the story that interests me is this first one, which is about the family. You see the images here that will become important as I go through this story. The book itself is divided into 25 chapters. They're all very short chapters. The whole story itself is about 110 pages or so. And the one way to interpret these chapters is that they're actually little snapshots. They're fragments. They're not chronological, so there is this kind of merging and blurring of the past and the present together. But it begins with a photograph of a large family. The photograph is dated 1904. And it is described that this is a Viennese Jewish family of Ignaz and Johanna Klagsbrunn and their 11 children. The penultimate child is Leo, who you see the gentleman on the top left, who was born in 1888. And in this opening photograph that is described in this text, Leo is 16 years old, and he will become the center of the novel. And as I've mentioned, the novel moves between the past and the present in such a way that the following chapter, the second chapter, is already set in Niterói, Rio, where Leo's grandson, the son of Peter, who dies quite early actually, becomes also one of the protagonists of the story. And he begins to narrate the tragic story of this family's exile to Brazil. And exile becomes this leitmotif of the text, where as the text is being written, we can see that Victor is actually attempting to reconstruct that history that is unknown to him. As the author says early on in the text, there was actually very little that Victor could tell him about the history of the forebears, because his father had passed away quite early on, and the grandparents had never really wanted to talk about that past. On the other hand, what we do have in this novel is that there's a pile of documents that Victor, the grandson, inherits from the family. And most of these documents had come from his uncle Kurt. And Kurt will also become an important figure in this story. And some of the documents are things that Victor later on in life, as I mentioned, once he goes into exile, he ends up in Germany. He lives in Austria for a while, where he actually begins to dig out the family history. And it is at the very core, at the very center, a story of persecution. And what becomes interesting is that the way in which the story is described in the second chapter, and I will quote here from the book itself, where it is described as a story of persecution worse than that of his parents or grandparents. And that I think, right away, that becomes really interesting, this idea of the comparison between a worst experience, because as we will find out, the experience of exile was extremely difficult for the family. And then years later, 20, 30 years later, with the grandson Victor uh, survives and experiences in the dictatorship, will actually be the equivalent, I guess we could say, that if the family had stayed in Europe without a way out. And so um, what we have here is that, again, we start with this photo, and through that photo, we begin to see how the story will be unfolding. The family had moved from Poland to Vienna. It's in the 1890s, where they had actually found great success for their hard labor. The father of this large family had worked in laundry material business. He had published books about this, and that launched him into a career as a producer of chemicals. And so we see the rise of this family during the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in each chapter of this text, we start to see how the story is being pieced together by the grandson. We learn that Leo marries Friederike Kohn in 1911. They have their sons, Peter in 1913, Kurt in 1918. Leo goes on to become a president of a football athletic club in 1930. Everything's looking beautifully for this family. But with the rise of Hitler's Third Reich, Leo starts to anticipate some political upheaval at the horizon, and that already sets him on a plan for immigration. And we are told by the author that when this upheaval started, and we have here on the screen in front of you, you will see in blue things that are happening in Europe. So the annexation of Austria in March of 1938, as well as Kristallnacht in November of 1938. And then we have in green something that is important that I will touch on in just a moment, which has to do with the history of Brazil, where the family will ultimately end up. And what we start to see is that this family starts to organize and to try and find a way to leave Austria. The father senses that it would be best for them to leave. And the top two contenders are, of course, the United States and Brazil, where they had relatives already living. They ultimately decide to go to Brazil because due to the 1924 Immigration Act in the United States, there had been really limited numbers of immigrant visas through the quota system for Jews trying to come to the United States at that time. And so they could have gotten visas through the United States, but not for the children. And so in order to keep the family unit together, they choose to go to Brazil. And they escape always in the last minute. This is such an incredible story about this family. They are always escaping in the last minutes. In the series of lucky events, the family is able to draw up a bill of sale for the family's firm, which is drawn up to the loyal maid. Her name was Maria Pfeiffer. Before they leave Austria in August. We know that 3 months later, Kristallnacht happens, and they leave right before the expropriation of Jewish property has come into force. And they're able to make their way to Portugal, Lisbon, where they await for their temporary visas. And here at the top, I know it's quite small probably for you to see, but at the top here, we have the image of what that card looks like for the family to be able to arrive in Brazil, their immigration card. And through a series of letters that appear in this text, we start to learn of how life-saving this moment was for the family, because we learn through the letters the tragic fate of Leo's 10 siblings who stay behind, and who will, throughout the novel, we start to learn what happens to each one of them during the Holocaust. And so the question now becomes, the family arrives in Rio in March of 1939. This is before World War II has started. And what is the country that they actually arrive in? What does Brazil look like at this time? And this becomes important for me to touch on what was happening politically in Brazil, because the history that is happening in the 1930s, in the 1940s in Brazil will actually be somewhat similar to the military dictatorship of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So there is a kind of continuum that one could argue based on this history. And so when the Klagsbrunn family arrives in Brazil, Brazil was actually undergoing a nationalistic political shift that was being led by then President Getúlio Vargas, who he had come into power in 1930 as the head of a military rebellion led by young officers. And then in 1937, he set up a pro-fascist dictatorship that lasted until 1945. Later on, he becomes president again in 1950 and then ends up committing suicide in 1954. But let's get us back to 1937 and that moment of the new state. This new state that Vargas establishes is one in order to created in order to perpetuate his governing power of his government and to stop pro-communist elements from gaining power in the coming elections. Now, at this moment, his attention focuses on actually two opposing movements that were unfolding in Brazil at this moment. Both were based on highly ideological European style movements. Both were very committed to European style mass mobilization. On the one hand, we had the pro-communist and the other one pro-fascist. And so in the case of the mass movement that was intimidating for Vargas was that is known as Aliança Nacional Libertadora, which was a left-wing popular front that had been launched by socialists and communists and other progressives led by the Communist Party in 1935. And then on the other hand, we have the image that you see in front of you, which is the Brazilian photographs from some meetings of the Brazilian Integralist Action, which was, it borrowed its propaganda directly from Nazi material. I'm sure, as you can see in these images, the salute that they're doing, their clothing, of course, they don't have a swastika. They rather have the symbol, the sigma, which they adopt as their signal. And they start to espouse fanatical nationalism based on very strong Catholic values. They're drawing support from the military officers. They're claiming rapid growing membership throughout Brazil at this time. And it was also created in 1933. And then both of these organizations that I have just described will be dissolved in 1937 with the new state. But this new state is really characterized by this quasi-totalitarian constitution in a coup d'etat that ends up shutting down the legislature of the country and starts to impose nationalization laws in schools and in the civil society. So this is the environment, the kind of world in which the family, the Klagsbrunn family, the Viennese family is arriving in Brazil in 1939. For them, this meant arriving in a country where Vargas had abolished the constitution, subjected newspapers and radio stations to censorship prior to their publications and broadcasting. He had banned all political parties. As it's written in this novel, and I will quote here, it says, opponents are locked up, tortured, or driven into exile. The regime lets the plantation owners keep their privileges, promotes the industrialization of the country, sets up state energy, corporations, and banks, and introduces labor laws on the fascist model by which it wins over new urban proletariat. So Vargas intensifies Brazil trade relations with Germany at this time. However, at the same time, issues this ban of political activity for foreigners, which is actually primarily directed at populations of German origin. So we can see, for example, in this image here, from a private collection in front of you, which is basically a posting that was spread around the country, describing a new law that has been passed that is forbidding people from speaking foreign languages. And at this time, foreign languages are actually no longer allowed to be spoken out in the streets or in the Brazilian school systems, and only Brazilian-born people are permitted to be teachers. So it's a really incredible moment of heightened nationalism. That is also, there's latent anti-Semitism that starts to appear at this time with restrictive immigration regulations. And so the family actually is able to, again, through this series of moments where they escape or they arrive right at the nick of time in order to be able to survive what is coming next. And so for the sake of time, let's move along with the history of this family. And talk a little bit about the grandson, who will be the person who is not only driving the narrative and creating, reconstructing the history of his family, he becomes the protagonist of the novel and the person who does create this connection between Holocaust memory and the dictatorship of Brazil. So he's born in 1946. This is the same year that a new constitution is introduced. By the time that he is a young college student studying economics, he is already convinced of the need for social and political change in Brazil. At the university, he meets and falls in love with Marta, who is the daughter of an officer, who I might add as a detail, because he didn't take part in the 1964 coup d'etat against the progressive president at the time. Her father was actually arrested, as were many members of the military who didn't go along with the coup. And as a punishment, he was transferred to a very remote town in the Amazon. And so Victor and Martha become involved with their university's left-wing Marxist political organization that has a slogan for democracy and the distribution of land against dictatorship. And so, they're really young people who are really excited about fighting against the repressive government that they see around them. And it is through their involvement, though, in these student organizations that we will see how the memories of the Holocaust and the memories of the dictatorship start to actually intermingle within the novel, as if they're one and the same, or a continuation of one another. Before I continue discussing Victor's unfortunate experiences with the Brazilian military regime, I must quickly just add a few words about that regime. As soon, as that military coup took place, and you see the dates on the board in green, March 31st of 1964, the new general Castelo Branco began instituting a series of institutional acts. And so here, before I move this slide, we have Victor being born. The dictatorship, the military coup happens in 64. 65 is when he's in college along with Marta. And it is in 65 that something quite dramatic happens that will have an impact in their lives. And so very quickly, you see here on the board the images of the first two generals that took power during the military regime. And the first one, as soon as he takes over, he starts to institute these executive power implementations, which superimposed the Constitution. In the end, there will be a total of 17 institutional acts that are passed from 64 to 69. But the first ones were, of course, to remove the current sitting president. The second one, the military officers declared the supreme command of that revolution. They installed generals as presidents. These acts dissolved the political parties since 1945. They began to create movements of closely monitoring the system, which meant that federal workers could be fired if they didn't comply with the new regime. Institutional Act number 3 established that the state governors had to be elected by the president himself. And so a whole system, there's a whole unfolding of the political system that starts to happen at this time. And so we obviously don't have time to go through each of them. But it is, in this moment that already under General Costa Silva, that Institutional Act number 5 of December of 1965 is passed. And this happens following the police murder of a young student by the name of Edson Luis during a protest. There had been a march. It's a well-known march called the March of the 100,000 that took place where students, mostly university students, and I know that Dr. Gonzalez also mentioned about the student organizations in 1968. So this is similar to that movement that was happening at that time. But this, of course, is in Brazil, where because of this protest, there's the death of a student by the police, and there is major chaos out in the streets, and Institutional Act 5 is introduced. And it actually is one that closes the Brazilian Congress. It places the Congress in permanent recess. It is a moment where goods are confiscated. And very importantly, it is the one that also suspends habeas corpuses for political prisoners. And this instigates a literal hunting down of people who are so-called subversives. And subversives become a kind of keyword for anyone who might be seen or interpreted to be against the military regime. So depending on how they look, how they dress, the kind of music they listen to, the kind of material they read, the kind of company they keep, might make them look like they're subversive. And so there is a hunting down of these people who are seen as possible threats to that military regime. And one of the last thing that I want to mention as far as the Institutional Act 5 is concerned is that it also establishes censorship similar to what was happening during the Getulio Vargas era that I mentioned about the censorship of books and radio. We see coming back again in 68, where different works are removed from circulation. Intellectuals and artists at this moment go into exile because they see what is coming, and specifically university professors and students become really a target for that regime. And just to give you an idea of what that moment meant with this institutional act, I have a little cartoon here that illustrates what living during this moment was like. Right? We have here an elephant, and there are two little snakes. And the snake closest to the elephant says, "Be careful, things are now very tough for snakes." And the elephant says, "But I'm not a snake." And then the other snake says, "Prove it to them." So it's exactly this, right? It creates an environment where a person would have to prove that they are who they are, that they're not what they don't seem to be. And so it creates this incredible, you know, moment of almost a psychological warfare, which is something that Bernardo Kucinski talks about in his novel K, and we will talk about in just a moment. In that same year, 1968, we have also the development of the National System of Intelligence, which was created as various espionage cells to function within various parts of society, at universities, churches, industrial companies, even the banks. There were pro-government spies everywhere that would inform the different organizations that actually did the dirty work about people who should be arrested, people who might have information. And this really becomes the heightened moment of this repressive regime, which is when we will see Victor, the protagonist of our story, become a victim of the system as well. And so it is under the government of Medici from 69, another general from 69 to 74, where you see three abbreviations there, the OBAN, the DOPS, and the Doi Codi. These are three organizations, agencies, repressive agencies that were created in order to have a better way to reach people. For example, OBAN was an organization created using members of the federal police, the civil state police, the military police, and selected members of the armed forces that was financed by private and corporate entities. DOPS was the Department of Political and Social Order. So there's a new department that wants to keep social order, and it had actually existed before. Again, the history of dictatorship in Brazil, like in Argentina and other countries in Latin America, is not always an isolated event, but rather we have to see it as a kind of chain that continues over time in different iterations, but in some ways it is always the same driving force. And so DOPS closely works with the censorship department. It was also the place where anyone who was seeking a job at the time had to actually get an official certificate proving that they had, quote unquote, good political and social behavior in order to be able to have that job. And then Doi Codi becomes the infamous location where actual interrogations take place, tortures, murders, and disappearances of bodies. And, this is in some ways a kind of overview of that system, because all of these um, all of these um, um, all of these factors come together in the lives of the people who we're talking about in the novels that I am discussing. And so here we have again, so just to bring us back to the timeline of the family of Victor and his wife, it is after the passing of the Institutional Act number 5 in 68 that they become a target for the regime. By this time, we are told in the novel that Victor is a employee of the state planning commission for coal mining. Martha is an employee of an editorial office, and and they keep a kind of secret political work going on at the same time, because they believe that a revolution will happen against the military dictatorship coming from the countryside of Brazil. And so, being a part of this kind of underground revolutionary group, they decide that it is time for them to actually relocate, to leave, and go to lead a landless peasants in the Northeast revolution. And the text actually states that even though this assignment that they had been given seemed really risky, they agreed in principle. And so they started to prepare for this operation. They give their things away, they sell their possessions. But before they're able to sell the last thing, which is their apartment, it is actually stormed by police on September of 1969. And they are threatened by men with machine guns. They are handcuffed to the post of the large colonial style bed. The apartment is searched for weapons. There are none to be found, but the pamphlets of their political organization are found. And so this is enough material, enough evidence of subversive political activity. Without going into graphic detail, it is important to add that they're taken along with 7 of their friends at the dark of night. That's usually how these disappearances would happen in Brazil. They're handcuffed, they're undressed down to their underwear, they're blindfolded so that they don't know where they're being taken. And they were taken to the place that Victor later finds out is the headquarters of the DOPS. And it is in recalling of this torture that happens to his body at the hand of these 2 naval officers that he says it was so bad that it can't be described, it mustn't be described. And so he was left without food for days, he was beaten, received electric shocks in the most sensitive areas of his body, and left in a location that was so small he could barely move. But what saves him in this moment is that Martha, his wife, who had been separated from him and he had endured her own interrogation, her father, remember her father I mentioned earlier on, he is able through his connections to find a way to pay someone who is willing to let them be released. And so in some ways, I always find it so interesting how during this time, the system that is monitoring quote unquote good social behavior is itself very much a part of a corruption scheme where, you know, if they're paid enough money, they will release people from their custody. And so as soon as they are released, you see here on the timeline, and again, we don't have time to go through all of it, but they go into exile to Chile first, where they once again barely escape the coup d'etat that happens. You see there an image in September of 1973. They leave to Argentina, and it's as if they're crossing bridges, and those bridges are falling off right as they arrive at the end. And they continue all the way to the moment which I already mentioned, which is when they're able to become, in fact, exiles in Berlin until 1986. And it is in that return to Germany that Victor's own memories begin to blur with that of his Jewish ancestors who once fled that place that now is welcoming him. While they are exiled in Germany, a new general takes over. This is a moment of opening that, again, we don't have time to go over, so I will simply, you know, talk a little bit about this idea that in this moment in Brazil, by 1979, the couple is exiled in Europe, but there is a law that passes, an amnesty law. This is, you know, something that happens in a lot of Latin American countries as they're dealing with the ends of their dictatorships, creating laws that will pardon those who were tortured as well as those who were the torturers. And so there's a long history of this happening. And the reason why this is important to mention is that it is what will allow this family one day to return to Brazil. And I can actually go back into that, into the, maybe if we have time in the questions, to go into the question of the commissions of truth, the moment where the opening up of democracy actually happens and what unfolds in that moment. But to return to the narrative of the Klagsbrunn family, it is in the moment that they are in Germany. They have their little daughter, Luana, and they begin an actual relationship with the Uncle Kurt, who had, as you recall, as a young man, immigrated to Brazil. He had become a successful photographer. And it is in this moment that Victor starts to realize that his uncle, who he thought his whole life, you know, was very closed off, didn't want to talk, and was simply a photographer, had himself in the 1940s actually been involved with an underground communist organization that mobilized, you know, that tried to mobilize mass opinion against fascism of the Getulio Vargas era. And in fact, he was a member of the National Students Union that greatly contributed to Brazil actually entering the war against Nazi Germany in 42. And so Victor finds great comfort in these stories that he begins to uncover and finally understand about his family, the silence that had existed within the family, and the fact that in the end of his uncle's life, they're actually able to come to a kind of understanding about their shared experiences. And in fact, you know, the uncle, being the photographer, when he passes, he leaves uh, hundreds of thousands of negatives of photographs. And I think that this image of the photograph is something that is so appropriate to bring up in when thinking about the question of memories of the Holocaust and dictatorship in Latin America, especially when we think about the work of Gustavo Germano, who is from Argentina originally and has been taking photographs since 1986, worked as a photojournalist for many years in newspapers in Buenos Aires, in magazines. And in the beginning of 2001, he moved to Barcelona, where he started to become engaged with the production of different kinds of photographs that dealt with social and civic memory. And the reason why I'm bringing up Gustavo Germano and his work is because I think that if we look at the few images that he has taken, it will actually help us to move along to the second novel, K, by Bernardo Kucinski. And so between 2006 and 2007, he worked on this project that's called Ausencias or Absences, which is an exhibition about the victims of forced disappearances during Argentina's dictatorship. And he truly captures in a deeply moving way the pain and loss that is created by state-sponsored violence. His work is very much informed by his own life story. We see here the image on the left side from 1969 of the four Hermano brothers. And then we have the image that was taken in 2006 with three of the Hermano brothers. And we see that Eduardo is missing. And Eduardo, his older brother, was actually detained, disappeared by the Argentine military dictatorship in 76, and his remains were only identified in 2014. And so this kind of work is deeply engaging with the question of how images, juxtaposing these images of the past and the present, can actually create a truly powerful experience for the viewer. Here in this case, we have a mother, Clara Alterman de Fink, whose son, Claudio Mark Fink, was disappeared. Here we have the image of a daughter, Laura Cecilia Mendez Oliva, whose parents, Orlando Mendez and Leticia Margarita Oliva, were disappeared. And between 2010 and 2012, Hermano then turned his project about absences to Brazil, where he traveled to Brazil and for 2 long years, he tracked down family members of those who had been disappeared during Brazil's dictatorship from 64 to 85, and he began to capture these moments as well. And here we have this image of Ana Rosa Kucinski Silva. And of course, you see the image on the right that was taken in 2012, and she is disappeared. And so in capturing this past and present, Hermano can acutely display this ever-present absence that remains. In the absence, the disappeared are present. And this leads us to our next novel, which at the very center of the novel K, which was published in 2011, is the absence of a daughter who is disappeared during Brazil's dictatorship. It is a novel that is based on the real life story of Ana Rosa Kucinski, this young woman who you see here in the photograph and who is missing from Hermano's photograph on the right. The author of the novel, Bernardo Kucinski, is a photojournalist. He is a journalist, I'm sorry, and he was a professor in the School of Communications at the University of São Paulo for many years, author of several books that had been published in Brazil and abroad. And he published, though, the first work of fiction in 1974. And I will talk a little bit more about this creative process in just a moment. Bernardo was born in 1937 in São Paulo to Jewish parents who had fled violence in their Polish village to Brazil. And he became a physicist in 67. He is one of the intellectuals that I mentioned that went into exile between 71 and 74 during the heightened period of Brazil's violence, state-sponsored violence. He returned in 74, and by that time, his sister was already missing. And so she and her husband, Wilson, were disappeared in 74. And it is only many years later that this fact is actually discovered as a fact. For many years, the family actually doesn't know what has happened to them. They have simply vanished from existence. And in this novel, I will move here, it is very interesting because while on the one hand, it is a fictionalized work of literature, it is very much informed by the real life disappearance that I have just mentioned. And so in this novel, we are actually told, the reader's told, that everything in the book is invented, but almost everything happened. And it is through this recollection of memory that have been buried for years that we have the memories of the father. The central figure in the story is the father, who is trying to piece together what has happened to the daughter. And for the sake of time, and I see that the clock doesn't wait for us here, that there is so much I would like to say about the novel, but for the sake of time, what is important is that the father in the novel is a Yiddish scholar who has spent most of his time with his fellow immigrant friends who are all Yiddish speakers, and they're interested in questions of language and learning. And he is startled out of his normal life when he starts to suspect that something went wrong with his daughter, who hasn't called him in a few days. And the story begins to unfold. We see how he is able to try and find information through informants and through people around him, that quickly he thinks they're his friends, but very quickly he starts to see that there's actually something off about them. And as the novel begins to outline his journey in trying to find a daughter, uh, we begin to see the traumatic memories from his youth actually appear in this novel as a driving force for the way in which he will go about this search. And so it is precisely the figure of the father that connects the memory of the present moment in Brazilian history to that distant past. When he realizes, for example, that a person he thought was a friend could actually be an informant, he remembers when he was actually fleeing from Polish police. And he says that his fellow countrymen had warned him about Getúlio's spies, that they were everywhere. And that was under fascism, he thinks. But he says, well, maybe actually that never went away. The government may have changed, but the informers never stopped to informing the government. And so he continues to draw these parallels. And the more he goes into this search, this endless, unsuccessful, heartbreaking search for the daughter, he comes to this realization. He says that, even the Nazis who had reduced their victims to ashes had registered the dead. Each one had a number tattooed in his or her arm. They had noted each death in a book. Of course, he is also aware, he says, that that was not the case every single time, that there were massacres, but even in the massacres in the villages, that the village members knew where these massacres had occurred, where the Jews had been buried. And then he says, in this moment of agony, of the uncertainty, he says that those had been mass executions, but now in Brazil, people are vanishing into thin air. And it is this agony of the father that really drives this story. And he begins to become more and more aware of the fact that the daughter has probably been taken. She has disappeared. He will not be able to find her. And it is in these moments that we see this kind of, he even says that for him, the disappearance of his daughter is a continuation of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust becomes this unspoken event looming in the background of the whole narrative, where, for example, in one of the moments where he actually is able to get a meeting with one of the military generals who might have some information, and he is climbing up the white marble steps of this building. And in that moment, he has a deja vu. He remembers something that has happened before. He says that he remembers a time when he was in Warsaw, going up the stairs to try and find information about his sister Gita, who had been arrested, who had been disappeared because of her political activity in Poland. And it is the foreshadowing image of his sister that then will continue to appear throughout the novel, as this image of what had happened in Poland is now in some ways reoccurring in Brazil. And even the ways in which he is questioned by the general himself about his daughter, when he says that she has disappeared, and the general says, well, what if she just fled to Buenos Aires with some lover? Have you thought about that? And that is exactly what had been told to him in Poland about his sister, that maybe she had run off with some lover to Berlin. And so it is in these moments in this novel that we really see the connection between these images, these memories that are so present throughout both texts that I have been describing. And in this one specifically, it is a really heartbreaking ending, because the ending, not to ruin the ending for anyone, but yes, the father discovers that the daughter has been a victim of the system. She has in fact been disappeared. And the way in which he dies is that he goes into, the last image is that he is in a prison cell, where he wants to talk with fellow prisoners about any information about his daughter. So he's actually visiting. He's not a prisoner himself, but he looks out the window. He says, a familiar little barred window from Poland that is now the same in Brazil. And so, drawing upon his memories of the Holocaust, he's able to understand the kind of mysterious unfolding of events that happened with the disappearance of his daughter. And not to go over time here, I think we should probably bring this to a conclusion, but it is an incredibly moving piece of literature, this novel, incredibly interesting, the way in which it shows this continuation of the fragmentation of memory, even many, many years later, in a whole other continent. And just to finalize, I would like to bring up, I want to end with the words, I had a chance to actually meet with Bernardo Kucinski last November when I interviewed him for a podcast, Translating the World podcast, which is a podcast for the Center of Translation at the University of Texas at Dallas. You can listen to this podcast where we discuss his novel, also his creative process. As I mentioned, K was his debut novel when he was 74. Today he's 84 years old. And when I spoke with him, he was busier than ever, publishing one novel after the other. And all these novels have to do with the disappearances, with that connection between the past and the present. And one of the things he said that I thought was profoundly moving, and the quote that I want to leave you with, is that it's a mitzvah for him to write about dictatorship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valente. As I mentioned there at the beginning, we do have some time for a few questions. So if you would, please go ahead and type up any comments or questions that you have in the chat. While I give some people some time to do that, I do want to apologize for any of you who got trapped in the waiting room. Zoom had a bit of a glitch and froze and wouldn't let me admit some of you. So apologies if you were one of the trapped there at the beginning. Also, as I mentioned, this is the third of our annual spring lecture series, and I put the links to the first two lectures of the series in the chat if you wanted to go and look into those if you missed them. I will also be distributing a similar newsletter about Dr. Valente's talk, and that will include a recording of today's lecture. So please feel free to share that with anyone you know who may not have been able to attend today, but would still be interested in seeing it. To get us started with the Q&A while people gather their thoughts and type them up in the chat, I did have one question submitted anonymously asking about the poster that you had shared that talked about the forbidden languages and the fact that those three languages, the Japanese, Italian, and German, were forbidden by law or punishable by law. Was it just those three languages specifically, or was it anything non-Portuguese that was punishable by law?
So it was mostly, it was actually all languages. So the law actually stated that it was forbidden to speak any language other than Portuguese. And this is a moment, this law is passed in 1938. It's called the Nationalization Law, that starts to actually really try and systematize the way in which the public education system worked in Brazil at this time. Now, if we think a little bit about Brazilian history, Brazil, of course, is discovered in 1500. It has a huge, long history. But as a nation that really begins to develop itself, we're really thinking about the end of slavery, which is 1888, and then the huge influx of European immigrants in the early 1900s. This will also have, to do with what I mentioned earlier about some of the immigration restrictions in the United States. This starts to drive a lot of these European immigrants to South America, to Brazil, to Argentina. And it is these immigrant communities that as soon as they would arrive in Brazil, they would create their own churches or their own synagogues, their own cemeteries, and most importantly, their own schools. And so the school system by 1938 is really not systematized. Each community is doing their own thing. The books that they're teaching the children, for example, in the Ukrainian, the Polish, the German, the Japanese communities, is the history of their original countries. It's not about Brazil, right? And so as an effort to create a new generation of quote unquote Brazilians who share this Brazilianness and to strip them from any kind of allegiance to outside nations, the enforcement of only Portuguese happens at this moment in time. And that poster specifically talks about these three languages because they were the most popular ones, but the law itself stipulated all languages and also all nationalities, in the sense that only people who were born in Brazil, native born in Brazil, could be teaching school children, for example. So all the teachers who were foreign born could no longer be employed by the public school system, for example. So it's an incredible moment that happens with this attempt under Vargas to create a very systematic type of society that is united by its Brazilianness rather than by its differences. And by
Great.
the way, I do see that we have some illustrious guests here. Hi, Dr. Shavath.
I was going to make sure you saw that. Dr. Oshvat
Yes.
has joined us and wants
Thank
you to
you
know that
for
she's very
being
proud of you.
here. Thank you so much. I just now actually see everyone. When I was presenting, I couldn't see anyone's name. So I'm sorry that I didn't say hello before, but I see a lot of you are here. Good old friends are here. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.
So Dr. Hone has a question in the chat. He said, excellent and very interesting presentation. Do you think that the forced disappearances that are happening in Brazil today, perpetrated by the authorities, are in any way similar to the previous military dictatorship, especially concerning Bolsonaro's glorification of the past military regime?
This is a really, really important question. Thank you, Matt, for this question. You know, when I was talking very briefly about the law of not law of return, for some reason I wanted to say the law of return, but I'm blanking now, I'm sorry. Just a moment here. With the institution of the national commissions, the National Truth Commissions, that were stated starting in the case of Brazil, 2011. It's a super recent occurrence. When we, if I could maybe share once again, just very quickly, Cindy, if you don't mind. Let me see if I can share here. Just very quickly, this image. Do you see? Let's see here. So the commissions of truths are these institutions that were put in place in order to come to terms with the past, right? And so when the laws of amnesty were passed, where basically forgave those who committed the crimes as well as those who were impacted by their political activities, such as the case of Victor, the commissions of truth had as a goal to create these reports. So Brazil's first report about what had just happened to the military dictatorship comes out in '85. This is a first preliminary document that appears. It is done with the help of the Archbishop of São Paulo. He was very much involved with families during the dictatorship who would come to him as a source because they thought he would hear people's confessions and he would somehow know about where others were hiding and things of the sort. So he becomes a really instrumental person. Then by 2011, under President Dilma Rousseff, who herself had been a target of the military dictatorship, she was imprisoned at 19 years old, suffered tremendous abuse and torture during her interrogations. And she becomes the president of Brazil, the first female president of Brazil. And it's under her government that the Commission of Truth is actually established to systematize a way in which we can understand what has happened and to find the actual names, the numbers, and the report is published. At that time, when she announces this, the loudest opponent of instituting a national commission of Truth was Jair Bolsonaro, who of course was a member of Congress at that time. Now Jair Bolsonaro, and I'll stop sharing now so I can see everyone again. Uh-oh. Cindy, did I? Oh, there it
Nope,
is.
you're
Okay.
good. You're good now.
And so he becomes the loudest opponent of this moment. He doesn't want this kind of recognition for the past. And so now, as we know, he is in fact the president of the country, where, you know, this kind of glorification of the military past is something that he has done throughout his long career as a politician. He has been known to actually boast about the fact that his grandfather was a member of, you know, Hitler's Third Reich. So he's a very problematic figure. But I don't see it as something that is isolated. Rather, as I try to demonstrate, if we think about the mechanisms of censorship, the mechanisms of restriction that were put in place by Getúlio Vargas in the 30s and 40s. Then we see this repetition happening in the 60s under the different generals. This is nothing but a simple continuation of that moment, where he is hearkening back to that past. He wants, in fact, even this year, you know, in previous years, there has always been a commemoration of the military coup as a way of remembering the past, trying to honor the victims. This year, there was a celebration of the revolution, right? So there is a change in the official narrative that we actually see happening at this moment. So it is, as you say, you know, it is a very problematic moment that we actually see happening in Brazil, you know, politically speaking. And then this has sadly had reverberations even in something as simple as how does the country deal with COVID, right? I mean, we see the huge destruction that is occurring in the country largely by the way in which the current administration handles certain aspects of society. So thank you for the question, Matt.
As you can see, there's numerous kudos in the chat for you, Sarah, so I hope you have a chance to see some of those. Dr. Gonzalez, I think, has just asked a question, and we'll let that kind of be our closing question to be respectful of everyone's time tonight. Can you talk a little bit more on the character of the nationalistic discourse on the ideal identity and type of citizen for the new Brazilian nation state?
That's a very good question, Pedro. Dr. Gonzalez, thank you for that question. So, you know, when we think about this moment of nationalization in Brazil, it is always within the context of an actual policy that was passed soon after slavery was abolished. As I mentioned, 1888 becomes a marker of that moment. As an effort, a political effort by the administrations at that time to whiten the Brazilian population. This is literally the name of this policy, is the policy of embranqueamento, which means the policy of whitening. And the idea becomes that with the coming of white Europeans to Brazil, who will then begin to mix, you know, mixed marriages will take place, then there will be this new kind of Brazilian identity that will be, it will emerge as part of this kind of miscegenation amongst the people. And
what is she?
Oh, hold on. Sarah, you're muted.
I'm sorry, did I?
Nope.
How far did you hear anything at all, or?
No, it was just the last few seconds. That's fine.
Oh, okay, yes. So the idea of, you know, this new Brazilian nation is one that is very much more European than in fact has anything to do with the actual Brazilian past, which is this kind of, you know, mixing of enslaved African people, the native people of the land, the Portuguese colonizers. So it's this kind of new, very European type of nation that will emerge in this moment. But it is, you know, there are so many contradictions that come in this moment, especially, for example, when we think about Vargas, right? He is on the one hand a deep admirer of what Hitler is doing in Germany, and at the same time he says, no, we have to, you know, go ahead and enter this war and fight, of course, at the pressure of the United States. So we have to, you know, put all of these global players in context with one another as well. So thank you all for the wonderful questions. I appreciated it. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm sure you all join me in virtual applause for Dr. Valente's talk. I went ahead and I put my email in the chat. If anyone wants to reach out to me, please feel free to do so. I'm also happy to forward anything that you would like to Dr. Valente if you have follow-up questions that she hasn't had a chance to answer just yet, or if you just in general would like to connect with her. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Bye.